Hello and welcome to the Taxcast, the Tax Justice Network podcast. I'm Naomi Fowler. In this episode, myth-making and spin about taxing the super wealthy. Will they really leave?
All these studies are saying, look, there is no significant impact. You can tax the rich.
Governments could increase their national budgets by 7% a year with a modest tax on extreme wealth. That's a potential global revenue of more than $2 trillion every year. Imagine that. But before that, in the previous Taxcast, we discussed the implications of Donald Trump's election victory for tax justice and the anti-corruption movement. I mentioned the Corporate Transparency Act was due to come into force in the States. Long, hard-fought legislation requiring companies to provide basic identifying information on their true or beneficial owners. It's the most consequential US anti-money laundering law in a generation. It was watered down, there were some exclusions, but the deadline for companies to report this information was the 1st of January 2025. I say was because a court in Texas has issued a nationwide preliminary injunction which halts its enforcement. The US Treasury Department has appealed. Back to wealth taxes. The world's full of examples of why some people have way too much money. This is Sotheby's, an auction house selling a banana taped to a wall to the highest bidder. This piece of artwork is called Comedian, and I'm not making this up.
A viral sensation that has skyrocketed to universal recognition when it was first exhibited at the Art Basel, Miami Beach in December 2019. Maurizio Catalan's Comedian. Here it is in all its splendor. Please note, cryptocurrency payments will be accepted on this lot in cryptocurrencies supported by our payment processor at $800,000, at $800,000, $850,000 now, $850, $900,000. Thank you, sir. 950 is with Otto Limit. 1 million is with me already, actually. 1,100,000 is your bid.
You bidding,
1,200,000.
At $5 million.
Don't miss this opportunity. It's going to go, and it's going to go fast. At $5 million for the banana, here it is. Only at Sotheby's. These are words I never thought I'd say. $5 million for a banana. It's your expensive banana, Jen, and the hammer is coming up. This is it. Final time. Don't let it slip away. 5,100,000. At 5,100,000. It's online at 5,100,000. Sotheby's.com at 5,100,000. At 5,100,000. The world's most expensive banana at 5,200,000. 5,200,000, and I'm going to sell it here. Fair warning, at $5,200,000. Jen, the Catalan is yours. Congratulations. Thank you very much indeed.
Yep, $5,200,000 for a banana taped to a wall with duct tape. It's $6.2 million with taxes and fees. Now, the owner of that $6.2 million banana has hit the news headlines. This is a Chinese-born cryptocurrency bro called Justin Sun. What you're about to hear is him having just untaped his banana from the wall and eaten it. He just said, it's much better than other bananas. It's really quite good. So, who is this guy? Justin Sun moved to the US when China banned an unregulated method crypto startups were using to raise initial investment. He's got his own problems now with US government investigations into his businesses. I'm sure this isn't related in any way, but he invested $30 million into Donald Trump's crypto scheme, World Liberty Financial. World Liberty Financial was a massive flop. Sales didn't hit the minimum needed for Trump and his sons to get their nice fat payout. But our $6.2 million banana owner's $30 million investment bounced lagging sales right up. That triggered a $15 million payout to the Trumps. A $6.2 million banana says to me that Justin's son has far more money than is healthy for us, or for him actually. I've got two words: wealth tax. And if we had even a moderate progressive tax on net wealth above a certain amount, we could raise global revenues of more than $2 trillion a year. The Tax Justice Network's done country-level estimates for 172 countries on the revenue potential. The inspiration for a version of our proposal is Spain's solidarity surcharge, so-called. Here's Alison Schultz of the Tax Justice Network.
The core model of Spain's solidarity surcharge is to have an annual tax on the net wealth above a certain threshold. This tax would only apply to the 0.5% richest of the population. So for Spain, for instance, these are the people who have wealth of higher than 3 million euros, and that's the net wealth.
Okay, and net wealth is the value of all the non-financial and financial assets owned by a person minus the value of all their outstanding liabilities.
Yeah, and whoever has a net wealth of more than 3 million euros in Spain would pay a 1.7% tax on that net wealth. However, you only pay the tax on everything you own above the threshold. So if I own 3,100,000 euros, I would pay 1.7% on these 100 euros. The tax is also progressive, which means that if you own even more, so those who have a wealth of more than 5 million euros, they would pay 2.1% per year, and those who own even more than 10 million euros would have to pay 3.5% per year, but again, only on the part of their wealth which exceeds 10 million euros. And we have translated this to other countries by just translating these 3 million, 5 million, 10 million steps, which we see in Spain, to the part of the population of the wealthiest. So the tax would only apply to the 0.5% wealthiest of each country. Then the second step would apply to the top 0.1% richest, and the highest, the 3.5% rate, would only be for the richest 0.05% of the population, like a very, very tiny number of people.
Okay, and why have you used this example? Because it's not like you're saying all countries should do exactly what Spain has done necessarily.
No. We started by using this example because it was a recently implemented tax. This was imposed on a very specific system which was already in place. These rates should be set in a democratic process. Parliament should think about the exact threshold, the exact rates. And we actually provide also a tool where you can see which different revenue gains you would have with setting different rates, tax rates, and also setting the thresholds at different thresholds for each country.
There are 3 important rules, Alison says, for governments wanting to introduce the best kind of wealth taxes based on research and past experience.
So these rules are first, and this is something where we think the Spanish system is good, is that the threshold should be set very, very high. We really want to tax extreme wealth here because this has been shown to be way better for the economy. We really want to target the extreme wealth above a very high threshold. The second rule is that you should not exempt any assets. So this is, for instance, something which is bad. We think in the Spanish proposal that some specific assets, for instance, artworks, also things like a yacht, would be exempted here. So we think that exemptions are just very inefficient, also make it very hard to enforce the tax. So we would say, no matter which wealth you own, this should be taxed. No exemptions for any asset class, because the rich will find ways to just invest in this one asset class and not in the other. And it's just something we don't want to see. It's bad economic reasons, it's non-efficient, and it's also hard to enforce because you really have to track where they put which money and why and so on. So no matter which kind of asset, we shouldn't exempt it. And then the third rule is, and this might be the hardest one, is to really establish beneficial ownership transparency. What does it mean? We really need to know who owns which asset in order to make sure the tax can easily be enforced. So this is a very important tax transparency tool which should come along with the wealth tax, and which should also, in the best case, be based on international cooperation so that people cannot just hide assets in another country. Having said that, wealth taxes can already be implemented, even though beneficial ownership transparency is not perfect, but there should be the push towards more beneficial ownership transparency with the implementation of the wealth tax. Then each country could also decide what's the exact threshold which fits us, what's the exact tax rate that fits us, and so on.
And wealth, what people have in terms of income, which most ordinary people understand, is we go to work, we get a certain amount of money per week or per month. And then for very, very, very wealthy people, their income can sometimes come from their assets, from the value of their assets accumulating, and isn't working or taxed in the way that our income is taxed.
Yeah, so this is also one of the main reasons that we do need a wealth tax. In most countries, we tend to tax income from labor relatively high. So we really have high tax rates on labor income. So if I'm working, I will usually pay, depending on the country, quite a high rate of tax. However, if I gain the same amount or way more of income from capital, meaning from my investments, from my ownership of shares, from me owning a company, and so on, this income would be taxed on average at way lower rates. Why is this so unfair? Because let's say the first 95 or even 99% of the population get most of the income from labor. So they actually do work and they pay a lot of tax. But then those who are the richest in the societies, they earn most of their income from capital. And that means that they are paying a lower tax rate on the income they generate from capital as compared to the average person. We don't tax income on capital or income which is coming from wealth enough.
People with that much wealth and assets would barely even notice a tax of the kind Alison's talking about. And a tax like that can save lives. Really can. Here in the UK, we've had a new government recently.
And as Big Ben strikes 10, the exit poll is predicting a Labour landslide.
Sir Keir Starmer will become Prime Minister with a majority of around 170.
When any new government comes in, especially a centre-left one, sort of centre-left, wealthy, powerful people and their wealth managers start worrying about wealth taxes. And it's always the same. Oh, you can't do that. The wealthy are going to leave. Have a listen to this media coverage about a supposed exodus from the UK.
Right, in the face of proposed tax reforms in the UK, a significant migration trend is emerging among high net worth individuals.
In total, 9,500 high net worth individuals, including 85 centimillionaires and 10 billionaires, are set to exit the UK before December this year.
There's a report out from some wealth managers talking about the absolute stampede of millionaires, British millionaires, to leave the country, an estimated over 9,000 likely to get the hell out. And no surprise, people are fed up.
Experts suggest that the British government could mitigate this exodus by reassessing its tax policies and creating a more stable economic environment to retain its affluent residents.
Research from Henley and Partners shows that 68% of these wealthy individuals will relocate to European countries.
The UK faces potential economic repercussions as it lost high-value contributors.
That figure you heard there of 9,500 millionaires supposedly leaving the UK was wall to wall across the mainstream media. 9,500 sounds dramatic, but when you put it in percentage terms, you get a different perspective.
It sounds like, it's a panic. It sounds like the UK is losing all these millionaires. That 9,500, that represents 0.3% of the 3 million millionaires living in the UK. That's hardly a migration trend. That is statistically insignificant. There's no way you could call that a migration trend, but it's everywhere. And we keep hearing it repeated over and over in the news.
I'm talking to Mark Mansour of the Tax Justice Network. So Henley and Partners, we come across them all the time at the Tax Justice Network. They're a key part of the infrastructure of professional enablers when it comes to tax havens and tax haven advice, helping the very wealthy adjust their tax affairs and their locations through investment schemes that can lead to, residence and even passports for sale, among other things, minimising their tax contributions potentially. In their own words, they say they're the global leader in residence and citizenship by investment. Each year, hundreds of wealthy individuals and their advisors rely on our expertise and experience in this area. The firm's highly qualified professionals work together as one team in over 60 offices worldwide. So this is a major outfit.
Yeah. All right. So taking aside the fact that this report produces a statistic that is insignificant, as immaterial, less than 1% is not a trend. According to UBS's Global Wealth Report, there are over 3 million millionaires in the UK. So 9,500 out of 3 million, it's 0.3%. So what this report is actually doing is confirming findings from other reports that looked at the impact of taxing the super rich, right? And all these reports show that if you tax the super rich, it results in a migration rate of less than 1%. So studies in Denmark, Norway, Sweden found the same things. And all these studies, in their findings are saying, look, there is no significant impact. You can tax the rich. But what Henley and Partners have done is they've taken the same finding, but spun it to make it sound like some huge exodus.
They make a lot of statements which we can't really see are necessarily backed up with evidence.
Yeah, if you wanted to dig into how this report actually is structured, how it's calculated, what's the methodology is, there's a whole Pandora's box here. So first of all, the methodology itself is quite thin, and the numbers are actually produced by New World Wealth, which we weren't able to find a lot of information about online. It seems to have only one staff member, and there's a couple of lines on methodology. They seem to be using online sources to find out where high net worth individuals are located, places like LinkedIn, but even then they say that their stats are based on where they believe these individuals are working, not necessarily where they're residing. So there's a lot left to be desired to sort of learn more about how these figures are calculated. But the report itself, so the way the report is represented is these figures are presented in interactive charts. And then below those charts, you have a bunch of what are essentially opinion pieces by a number of different people. And this includes, people working at Henley & Partners, directors and executives and so on, and some folks who are external. But none of these pieces are actual research papers. Nowhere, at least I could find on the website, is an actual research document explaining how the research was conducted and so on, aside from this, short methodology note at the very bottom.
In the media, we often hear about top taxpayers leaving the country if there's tax reforms that are going to disadvantage them. So this concern about immigration can often be like a barrier to tax reform.
This is Victoria Gronwald of the LSE, London School of Economics. She's co-author of their report, Tax Flight, Britain's Wealthiest and Their Attachment to Place.
Our report is the result of a qualitative study. We were interested in how wealthy individuals and top income earners make decisions about where they live. And then, of course, how taxation plays a role in that decision-making process. And there are some quantitative studies, even though few, that actually show that this tax-induced migration is more limited than what media and some policymakers portray. And with the qualitative study, we could just access kind of the motivations of people, the kind of underlying thought processes of them, which is something you can't do in quantitative research, of course. And interestingly, we found that none of the people we interviewed were kind of planning to migrate for tax reasons or had also not considered tax reasons as like a major decision-making factor in their moving decisions previously. We found that other considerations like career paths, family ties, attachment to their homes, of course, especially London as a cultural hub, they all made the UK as a very attractive place to them, even if there were tax reforms.
Right. And so you interviewed 35 high net worth individuals. So I was just wondering how you found them and why they were willing to speak to you, because it's not the easiest demographic to access.
Yeah, absolutely. It's a big challenge in academic research as well, to access these kinds of people. And we were very lucky. There was a survey that was sent out in 2022 from a project run by Professor Sam Friedman, who's one of the co-authors of the report, to individuals that feature in the Who's Who, which is like a list of influential people in the UK. So we had 20 interviewees that were recruited through this survey, that filled in a survey and then said they would be open to qualitative interviews as well. And then we had 15 interviewees that were recruited through personal connections, organizations where the wealthy kind of convene and discuss issues around their lives. So motivation, it's difficult to assess. I think probably they're motivated partially to participate because the topic of inequality is very salient nowadays. It's discussed a lot in the media, a lot in public discourse. And I think often interviewees for academic research are just motivated by curiosity about the research, and they want to share their perspectives on certain topics.
And here are a few excerpts from some of those wealthy people interviewed for the LSE report. They're AI voices, so they sound a bit robotic, but you get the idea.
I wouldn't leave for tax reasons. I wouldn't leave because the tax rates were too high or because I was expected to pay my share. I wouldn't go to a tax haven.
You need to be a certain character to move for tax purposes.
At the end of the day, if you make tax your be-all and end-all in terms of determining your decision as to where to live, I think that's probably a dangerous thing to do in terms of your mental well-being and everything else, you know?
The only time I had an obvious opportunity to live abroad for a bit was when my husband sold shares in his company, and his accountant came along and said, if you go and live in France for 2 years, you won't have to pay capital gains tax. But we were so horrified by that suggestion that we didn't move abroad and we paid capital gains. The accountant talked to us for about a quarter of an hour, and then he looked at us and said, I can see that you are not going to do this. And we said, no, we are not. We thought it was immoral.
You take your choices if you want a sort of social system that cares for you from cradle to the grave and is always there. It's expensive. I'm just saying, you can't have your cake and eat it. You've got to decide what sort of country you live in. I mean, Scandinavia has had the social democratic model for 60 years. Taxes there are very, very high, but people perceive that they get value for money because you have a level of social care and welfare.
I think tax is essential. We have really got to be mindful of the fact that we have got an infrastructure that is crumbling around us, whether it is health service, schools, which are the fundamental bedrock of our society.
When it comes to your research, you do pick up that there is a real stigma among the very wealthy that you spoke to that is developing around tax minimisation. You know, reputational damage is more of a concern. That would definitely tie in with what I've heard from some wealth managers that I've spoken to, is that, you know, when they get the younger generations in particular, they're telling them right from the start that they don't want tax planning as part of the service that they're going to be giving them. And this is quite a new and accelerating trend.
Yeah, so we certainly saw the stigma come up in our interviews. To us, it was actually probably one of the most interesting and maybe also surprising findings of our study. So it was very striking that several interviewers spoke quite negatively about individuals that move primarily for tax reasons, and they kind of judged them on moral grounds. And it's interesting to hear about younger generations that have a different attitude towards tax planning. We also need to acknowledge, of course, that in qualitative interviews, there's always this aspect of to what extent are the answers influenced by the person that sits in front of the interviewees. So to what extent do they also tell us kind of what we want to hear? We try to preempt this risk of interviewing by not starting off with the tax question. So we kind of guided the interview more naturally around what factors they value in terms of where they live. We asked about their migration histories. whether they had moved previously, whether they were planning to move, what is important to them in these decisions. And in some interviews, tax came up naturally, and then we would kind of deepen that. And in some interviews, tax actually didn't really come up naturally at all. So then we had to add it in at the end.
And some of the attitudes towards tax havens as they perceive tax havens. Tell us a bit about that, because that is very interesting.
Yeah, so we had quite a few individuals that, when we spoke about maybe locations that are more attractive in terms of tax. So, the typical ones that we always hear are, go to Jersey or Switzerland, Dubai is, I guess, in the media a lot for like young professionals especially. And a lot of them kind of responded describing these places as boring, having no culture, and it's not really like a place that they would desire to live. So many interviews then highlighted the importance of London's cultural infrastructure. So being able to go and see the opera, classical music, art, obviously of like the highest quality to them was what made London so attractive. And in their minds, you wouldn't have that in some of these so-called tax havens. And this again was a surprising finding to us. We didn't necessarily think that some of them had like kind of negative views. I, of course, found it quite amusing because I'm from Switzerland and we had some interviewers who referred to Switzerland as boring. So that was quite amusing personally.
There was a moment when the banker's tax came in. They wanted to go up to 50%. My husband said we should move to Switzerland. I said, no way. Switzerland is boring.
What puts me off it is that I have a nice life here in London, My clients who moved to the Bahamas were bored to death. Sun, sea, and sand. Okay, it's great for a couple of weeks to charge the batteries, but after a while you think, well, I'd quite like to go and watch an opera. Well, you can forget that. There's not a theater in the Bahamas.
I wouldn't go to a tax haven. Can you imagine anything worse than going to a tax haven? Some tiny little place with just people with yachts and servants. So no, I wouldn't leave for that kind of reason. I mean, I want to live in a vibrant economic climate where there's room for innovation and, people are inventing. And I think London is like that.
If you move to the Middle East and you are in gated communities and stuff like that, I never found that attractive in any way.
I think a lot of what they mentioned in terms of the culture, the kind of convenience of living in London and being able to get everywhere with the bus or the tube, the health system, the education, the safety, the public transport system, and so on actually depend on a progressive tax system and on everyone contributing to a country that is attractive to live in. So I thought also that was very interesting.
What surprised you most about the responses you got from these interviewees?
I think I personally was definitely most surprised about how many of them distance themselves about this, like from this idea that the wealthy and top income earners are purely economically motivated and, that they would leave. Like some of them talked quite negatively about this idea, but they also mentioned like maybe, few people that they know who might have been very much motivated by tax. Important to mention that it wasn't like a majority of their acquaintances, but they would talk about this quite negatively, and also in some cases even in relation to this responsibility to contribute to the country as well. I mean, there's also a certain attachment in some of them, of course, to Britain, a lot of people have to their home countries. And so this idea, that you also want to contribute something definitely also came up. So the stigma around tax migration was interesting because I think it is quite different from what we read in the media. We tried to interview a range of political kind of leanings. For the people from the survey, that was easy because they answered some questions around their political views, so we knew their political leanings. For the others, it kind of came out more in the interviews. And we definitely had like a range of views, and we had people that definitely would be concerned about tax rises, tax reforms, would be very critical of them. But some of them mentioned that in order to make the move, it would have to get quite extreme. So it would have to be like a very drastic tax change, change in government policy. And it wouldn't be kind of these more regular tax reforms that we're seeing. But that's not to say that they are happy about them. I think there's one important thing also to say about, that migration isn't the only option for the kind of people we're talking about. They obviously have other means of planning their taxes in certain ways. And so it's not like they always just have to leave the country when there's a tax reform. They have other means. They often have tax advisors and so on that can help them structure their taxes in a more beneficial way. So migration is not the only way and might not be the first thing that they jump to.
Yeah, I'm glad you said that, actually, because one of the things that is really worth understanding about this fear of these so-called wealth creators leaving the country is that in some ways, some of them have already left in terms of their assets and the way that those are taxed and structured in all sorts of complex ways. There's little evidence to justify that the very wealthy will leave a country solely because of tax reforms. As I said, once you get past a certain point in wealth, you wouldn't even notice a tax rise of the kind we're talking about. But it's a myth that endures and gets pushed. My colleague Mark Mansour has some sobering statistics for us that he'd gathered when we spoke.
The Henley and Partners report is averaging about, over 1,400 media hits a month. So in comparison, I looked at how much coverage this London School of Economics study received. And since it's come out 10 months ago, it's only been covered about 62 times or so, as far as I could tell. We published our own wealth report with similar findings that the super rich do not relocate. It's a migration rate of less than 1%. And we got about 320 media hits in August, which is a big number for an NGO like us. But again, these are small drops in the bucket compared to the amount of media attention given to this Henley and Partners non-report.
You've been listening to the Taxcast from the Tax Justice Network. Check out the show notes for further reading. You can listen to the Taxcast wherever you get your podcasts. Our podcast website has all our podcasts in 5 different languages, all independent productions at podcasts.taxjustice.net. You can also hear the first series of the Corruption Diaries there as well. Thanks for listening. We'll be back with you next month. Bye for now.